I would say the last 10 years, really the solar farms, you may know this, but the price of solar has come down pretty steadily. And with that, it's become, almost in the money for utilities to start building more of these solar projects. And what happened about 5 years ago in certain states was that they could build these projects through private developers. So the old way of doing things is power plants were traditionally built by the utilities, nuclear, coal. And when the solar came around, the utilities were more interested in buying the power via power contracts. And so it opened up this huge real estate opportunity for private developers to come in and build their facilities. And so while solar's been important and big, it's also created this really big private market for investors and really, real estate type developers to come in and build these projects and own them. So that's where we got involved, was working on behalf of these groups that were looking for very specific parcels. And yeah, our business is basically we identify these parcels using some technology, and then we work with landowners to help them find a suitable developer to enter into a long-term lease for their property to build a solar project.
That makes sense. And so if I'm understanding this correctly, it's almost like a mini public-private partnership in the sense that utilities are partnering with private individuals to kind of hedge that risk, and then they benefit from the energy generation, and the world benefits from clean energy, right? It's kind of the deal, kind of a triple win.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's basically the utilities, their responsibilities to deliver power to the stakeholders, and how they get that power. They don't necessarily have the charter or the mandate to create that power. So by using the power lines they have to deliver the community the power, they basically are saying, look, we don't need to buy and hold, or we don't need to build and own these things anymore. We just need to get access to it through these power contracts. So I think that's fair to say. Yeah.
I'm really curious about the landowners as well. Can you talk a little bit describe what this landowner would be thinking and what their opportunities to create income on that land would be, and then why it would make sense to go into the solar development?
Yeah, I would say a good number of our landowners are farmers. And so they're looking at, their current use for the property is usually some sort of ag, where maybe it's soybeans, corn, and they might get, say, on the high end in some really deeper agriculture markets like the Midwest, they might get $200 to $300 an acre for leasing that property for farming. The solar projects can support probably 3-4 times that in an annual rental payment. So, there's a strong financial component that's just very compelling on face value to lock into a long-term lease. I think the other thing that's very interesting to them usually is they don't have to sell their property. So to realize a real estate event like this, traditionally, it means selling your property for some sort of development. The solar projects, the useful life of these are typically 30 to 40 years. And so they would enter into a long-term agreement and just lease these properties. And so for farmers and a lot of rural landowners that don't necessarily want to let go of their property, it's a good fit.
Gotcha. Is it more of land that's just been kept in the family, almost like a better source of stable income for those who are planning on holding on to that asset long-term, if that's their priority? Is that more of the ideal landowner here?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with investing in solar land is that the development process is long and it's pretty risky. And so we know that you have certain power lines that make this a potentially good site, but that work that a developer does to spend money to get the engineering done, the studies, the interconnection study with the grid, that's all very expensive. And so if I were going to go speculate and buy a piece of property, I really probably wouldn't want to buy it before I knew I could build a solar project on it. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the challenge for, say, Main Street investors jumping into the solar land investment business. It's usually a little bit of a big boys game, because there's a lot of capital you have to put at risk to get a project done. And maybe I'd start, I thought this was an interesting point, is people, I think it's important to see really what's driving the development, like you said. I mean, especially, looking at Biden's infrastructure plan, it's common for most people to look at this and think that the federal government is really driving energy policy, but in effect, they're very limited on what they can do. I mean, that's more of the tax credit that's available as a federal tax credit that's offered for solar projects. But that's a fairly blunt instrument to promote solar development. And that's about as, I would say, far as they can go. And they've pushed it as far as they can there. A couple of the other things they're doing are to make it easier for transportation, some transmission line right-of-ways to get preference where states can't push back on stopping the development of those lines. So making it easier to protect these transmission corridors and saying, look, we can fast track development of the infrastructure and the transmission line improvements in those areas. But the most of the solar policy is at the state level. Energy policy is almost exclusively at the state level. So for that reason, you're looking at almost by state boundaries. You can go down the list and see which states have promoted utility scale solar and which ones haven't. And by and large, by no surprise, most of the left-leaning or Democratic states are going to be the ones that have popped sooner. It almost seems a little odd because some of these states like Massachusetts and Washington State and Michigan are some of the biggest states for solar, but no sunshine. So it always kind of struck me as odd that you'd think like Florida as a sunshine state would have the biggest solar boom and one of the first out there, but it's not as much to do with the production of the energy as it is to do with the incentives provided by the states and how they promoted solar within those boundaries. So
that makes sense. Have you been around long enough to see a cycle where a state goes from not having these incentives to having these incentives and seeing what the market does, how it reacts with the big boy developers or even private developers trying to get in the game?
Yeah, we've had the opportunity to see a few of these cycles, and probably the best example of almost a fully maturing market is California. They were so early on and had so many incentives pushed against it, and I hesitate to speak too much to it because that was happening in almost the early 2000s before we got involved. So from a real estate angle, probably the most mature market since we've participated have been North Carolina and Massachusetts and New Jersey, some of these markets on the East Coast. But it is interesting to see how, I think from a real estate perspective, there was a huge supply of land back in North Carolina in 2015, where landowners were more than happy to sign up for this type of arrangement. Their best alternative was to grow crops. They could get a solar lease. They could get the 3 times the revenue. It was very easy to see. I think the maturity that we're seeing is the competition amongst the developers, where it's no longer a question of is soybeans are the best alternative for this. It's how do we compete against other developers that are trying to get this for solar. So in the real estate parlance, we talk about highest and best use for a property. That highest and best use is pretty well realized in most markets across the country now, that solar is becoming the dominant choice. If it's a suitable site for it, landowners are hearing from multiple developers and are able to evaluate that.
Can you give us kind of like a breakdown of what your markets are that you play in, and do they have different characteristics of why the solar investment is better? Like, is it better for one kind of developer versus another based on which market it's in?
It's not so much on the investment side with how they're looking at where to place their dollars. Once these projects are built, they're actually very similar. I mean, it's just solar panels. I mean, you can fit one here and they just build it and stamp it, a million times over to put it in a field. And most of these are secured by a long-term power purchase agreement with the utility. The useful life of the panels, just like real estate, how long will this building last that we're in? They look at those at around 35 to 40 years. So honestly, that's part of the appeal for these is once you get an operating project, they all look a lot alike. Secured by a utility, backed by a high credit, tenant in a sense. But the real risk is about how early to move into which markets and how to assess that development risk. So large projects might come with higher ticket interconnection costs because you have to build a substation or tie into some of these high tension power lines, which may take more time and might be a bigger risk than saying investing in 5 of these smaller community gardens in a different state. And the arc of the policy risk is something to think about as well. So you can move into a state early when you might have this murmur of a new incentive package that is working its way through the state legislation, or it could be something that's a fully baked program that we know what those incentives are. And so there's an entry point along that curve as well. And so I think those are probably the biggest drivers is the type of projects you're getting into and the timing of when you enter the markets. Because there's probably a good, 20 states left that haven't even crossed the edge of really, widespread implementation of solar. So there's a long way to go left in the country.